Bill 21 came into effect in 2019 in Quebec. It essentially says that public employees in positions of authority cannot wear religious symbols at work. But for many, including some big city mayors, it means much more than that. With us now on whether it's an inflection point that the rest of Canada ought to weigh in on, let's welcome in Montreal, Quebec, former independent Senator André Pratte, who is now a principal at Navigator. In Chelsea, Quebec, writer Noha Bashir, and in the nation's capital, Paul Wells, senior writer for Maclean's. And we're very happy to welcome all three of you tonight for this discussion, which, well, I was going to start by saying it's timely, but Paul, that might actually get to the first question, which is this bill passed in 2019, and somehow 2.5 years later, it suddenly became a cause célèbre for some in Quebec and much of English Canada. Can you explain off the top that time lag?
Yeah. What happened is it wasn't until December of 2021 that the law was applied as written and intended. It wasn't until the end of 2021 that a teacher was removed from a classroom for wearing the offending headgear, a Muslim hijab in the specific case at hand. What had happened until then was the bill was introduced and passed. Teachers and other public servants to whom the bill applied, who were already employed at the time of the bill's passage, were sunsetted, grandfathered, however you want to say it. They were in no danger of losing their jobs or being reassigned. It was only new hires, and there were no new hires because school boards understood that this law was in place. And only in 2021 did the West Quebec School Board, needing to find someone to go into a COVID affected classroom, the third new hire in the school year, did they finally hire Madame Envari, the teacher who ended up getting reassigned. They say it was a misunderstanding. They didn't understand that she was going to wear her hijab in the classroom. Some people suggest that it was Western Quebec School Board is an English school board that has never liked Bill 21, and they may have done it to be a test case, but there was no test case until then. And the other half of it is that Quebec is the largest reservoir of swing seats in any federal election. There are many seats in Quebec that have been represented by members of 4 or 5 different parties in the last 30 years. So every party thinks that they might get lucky this time. So every party treads lightly when it comes to Quebec. And even though most ordinary members of the Liberal Party, the NDP, and the Conservatives don't like Bill 21, they decided to keep quiet about it because they were hoping to not blow their chances in Quebec. And the other thing
that explains the time lag, and we'll come back to the politics a little bit later as well. Yeah. Noha, I want to bring you in here because you and your family have a direct connection to this story. You want to explain what that is off the top?
Yeah, well, so my children actually go to the school in question. Neither of them were in the affected classroom, but I have a lot of friends whose children are in the affected classroom and who were very concerned and very upset when they heard about it. And so I first heard about it from a friend of mine, actually, while I was out doing groceries. And she called me and said, did you hear about the teacher who was removed? And it was actually in her son's class. And it hit really, really close to home, obviously. And the community was rightly very upset and very, very bothered about this, because this was a class that had, had a teacher that wasn't available, and then they got this teacher and the students all loved her, and then to have her removed, as I understand it, so she's been in my kid's class a few times as well, supply teaching or whatnot, or as a resource teacher. As I understand it, from that specific classroom, they all really, really appreciated her. She was a very creative teacher. She helped kids who were struggling otherwise, maybe with, it's been a really rough couple of years on the children, and we already have a teacher shortage. So to have something like this happens just kind of shows the absurdity of it all.
Although I've seen that you have written that you thought a moment like this was, and I believe the word you used was inevitable. Why did you use that word?
Well, so when I said that it felt inevitable, I was talking about a law like Bill 21, specifically this moment. Yeah, I think it's interesting to me because as a member of the affected community, um, we were raising the alarm and we've been saying, hey, there's a problem since 2019 and before it. Because before I lived in Chelsea, I also lived in Montreal for quite a while. And when I first moved to Montreal, the reasonable accommodations debate was happening. And it felt like every time I turned on the radio or I read something out there, it was always a discussion about visible minorities and like the issues surrounding visible minorities. So what can people be reasonably expected? What kind of accommodations do we have to give? And I found it really surprising as someone who grew up in Ottawa and had lived in Ontario my whole life that this was something that was such a constant topic, because it had never been a topic of my life. I've been a visible minority my whole life, but it had never been made to feel an issue. And in the time that I lived in Montreal, first there was the Reasonable Accommodations Commission or debate, and then shortly thereafter, it felt like, okay, that's finally died down. We don't have to feel like the center of everything for a while. Suddenly, the Charter of Values was another what felt like a trial balloon. So to me, when one thing after another keeps coming up and they're all almost different flavors of the same discussion, Bill 21 really felt inevitable, because it felt like it's only a matter of time before whichever government will find a way to make this stick, that something that will, in one way or another, target this community that, there's a problem, obviously, like they feel that there's a problem with religious symbols and not wanting people to, I take it as not wanting people to participate in public life, like finding a way to keep hijab wearing or religious symbol wearing people out of public life in some capacity or another. And Bill 21 is the one that finally succeeded at doing that.
Well, Andre Pratte, we need to hear from you, and let's set it up by saying that you are talking, obviously, to an overwhelmingly Anglophone audience right now, but I think an audience that wants to have a greater understanding of why Bill 21 is apparently as popular as it is among Francophone Quebecers. Help us understand that, if you would.
Yes, complicated. First of all, I must say that I'm against this bill. I've been against it since it was first introduced, because I think it is discriminatory and goes against both the Canadian Charter of Rights and the Quebec Charter of Rights. I think the issue really here is that most Quebecers have a problem with religion, and that goes back to the times when Quebec was a so-called priest-ridden society, where the Catholic Church had a lot of control not only on public life but also on Quebecers' private lives. And the Quiet Revolution in the 1960s was, amongst other things, an attempt by Francophone Quebecers to get rid of this control of their lives of the Catholic Church, which they did. And the church now today is much less influential than it was. And so I think many Quebecers see any attempt by other people who practice their religion as an attempt to bring back religion in public life, in schools, in hospitals, and even in government. So that's not an excuse. I think that does not excuse Bill 21, but it may be one part of the explanation why this bill has been so popular, although some polls have shown recently that support is now closer to 50% than over 60% as it was a few months ago. And maybe that's because it became something concrete with this story of the teacher that had to be reassigned because her veil was against the law.
Well, Paul, I think you wrote that you thought Bill 21 was enacted based on, again, your quote here, silly reasoning. What's the silly reasoning you're referring to?
So it is reasoning, more or less what Andre just described. And it's reasoning that I have done more than a lot of my Anglophone colleagues to try and understand and embrace. And I mean, basically the cultural roots of Bill 21 are the fact that it's not a hypothetical in Quebec, the notion that men and women dressed in religious garb might tell you what to do. That's a large and difficult part of the somewhat recent history of Quebec. And so the argument has arisen and been fairly broadly accepted that the state not being an instrument of religion, nobody who acts on behalf of the state may show any sign of adhering to a religion. That the simple act of dressing the way your religion counsels you to dress constitutes proselytism. That if I go to the license bureau and I'm getting my license plate form from someone who's wearing a crucifix, then that person is subtly trying to convert me. I mean, I'm sorry, I have a hard time saying this with a straight face. The idea is that the state must have no religion. But the state has no particular size, and yet tall people and short people can work in the license bureau. The state has no particular partisan affiliation, and yet every public servant is free to vote and to let people know how they're voting. And for that reason, I've gone down. I've written a piece about the heritage of the culture of the Quiet Revolution as a inspiration for this sort of laws that some of my colleagues in Toronto still make fun of to this day. I've tried hard to buy this. I don't buy it. It is by its very nature a bill that imposes the preferences of a majority against minorities. It imposes no cost on people named Wells or Pratte, and only on people whose names are Bashir and Anvari.
Okay. Except that, Andre, well, how do I put this? The notion that, let's take Paul's examples there. Do you think those analogies work? Let's just start there.
I think they do in part, because, for instance, public officials, certainly in Quebec, cannot wear a sign saying, you know, I'm voting liberal or I'm voting conservative or whatever. So there is a distinction. But I listen, I agree that this bill does exactly what Paul said. That is, try to impose the majority's will on minorities, and in particular the minorities' practice of religion, which is why it goes against, it violates both the Canadian and the Quebec Charter. And that's, I think, an argument that surprisingly Quebecers have not heard enough. Many of the bill's opponents, or the law's opponents, focus on the Canadian Charter, so-called imposed on Quebec in 1982. But this bill pushes aside the 38 first clauses of the Quebec Charter of Rights to protect the law from any challenge based on the right to life or the right to organize or to practice religion or whatever. So, I mean, this bill goes against a charter, Quebec Charter, that was voted unanimously by the National Assembly in 1975, and that up until recently was an object of pride in Quebec. You know, the fact that we had adopted a Charter of Rights unanimously even before the Canadian Charter of Rights came to be. And now, apparently, this is not important anymore. And so, I mean, I agree with Paul. I find it difficult to to conclude that someone who wears a scarf is trying to convince kids in third grade that they should adopt Islam. I mean, to me, that doesn't make much sense, but it does come from the idea that this is what happened in the past, that priests were trying, Catholic priests, were in fact using the school system to convert kids to the religion, and even in many cases convince them to become priests themselves.
All right, let me pick up this angle then with Noha. There certainly was the suspicion among many Anglophones that Quebec was being incredibly hypocritical when, for example, it said, we have this policy of secularism, we don't want religion anywhere in public life, but we're going to allow this massive crucifix in the National Assembly, that's okay. But those days are gone. They haven't said crucifixes are allowed. They've said nothing is allowed. Do you see anything in that argument that makes sense to you?
I don't, because I think what you're doing is applying, a crucifix hanging on a wall or not hanging on a wall is symbolic, Whereas for me, wearing a hijab is a tenet of my faith, and it's something I do as something I have to do as part of my faith. Now, I wouldn't say that any other Muslim woman has to make that choice. It's a deeply personal choice, but it's not the same as like, it's not the same as saying, you know, I have to wear a specific cultural item, or wear a verse of the Quran around my neck on a necklace or something like that. The hijab for me is a tenet of my faith, and it's very meaningful and important that I wear it as part of my identity. I don't leave the house without it. So the idea that I can simply take it off if I'm a school teacher or in one of these positions that's affected by the bill, and then put it back on at the end of the day doesn't actually fly, because I need to wear the hijab at all times. Now, the application of saying, well, you know, we have the crucifix on the wall or we don't have the crucifix on the wall, again, what cost does that draw from anyone? So back to Paul's point, if the tenet of my faith that was required, if I was a Christian who wore a cross around my neck and I needed to then tuck it into my shirt to go to work, and that doesn't affect me practicing or not practicing my faith in any way, there's no cost drawn there. But to force a Muslim woman or, you know, a Sikh man, for example, to make the choice between that career, that job, and their faith is a much bigger choice that you're forcing upon someone. So
yes,
I don't
take your
see
point
the
on
two
that
being equivalent. I think that simplifying that they're all religious symbols and so they're all interchangeable is really an oversimplification.
I take your point on that. But Paul, this often at the end of the day gets down to discussions about who's a majority and who's a minority. And the reality is, Noha may be a minority in the province of Quebec, but Quebecers, of course, are minorities in Canada and in North America. How do you resolve all of those issues about whose minority rights are more important?
Well, I'd be surprised if Andre liked the notion that Quebec is merely a minority within Canada or North America. Quebec is the local national majority in what the House of Commons has recognized as the nation of Quebec. I mean, I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate here. Frankly, majorities impose their cultural preferences on minorities all the time. It's just that that shouldn't be a justification for doing it, and you should weigh offense against remedy carefully in every case. I think that the reason young Quebecers are increasingly unimpressed by the kind of quiet revolution generated arguments that we've been rehearsing for you now is that this is meaningless to them, and they agree with everyone on this panel that Bill 21 is essentially a remedy to a non-existent problem. It's no one's problem if people dress differently. And while the remedies imposed by Bill 21 are not catastrophic, that teacher was not fired; she was reassigned, incidentally, to a task that allows her to continue working as an educator. In slightly more extreme situations, people might decide simply that they can't exercise their craft or their profession in Quebec, and they'll move at limited cost to other very nice Canadian jurisdictions. So I'm trying hard not to say that this is the worst law ever or that it's rank bigotry and so on. But I keep coming back to it's a set of dumb solutions to non-existent problems. I'm afraid that's the best I can say for it.
Dumb solutions to non-existent problems, maybe so, but Andre has been warning English Canada, I think I have this right, not to push too hard against Bill 21, regardless of how much antipathy English Canadians may feel towards it, lest a provocation to a new separatist sentiment in the province be stoked. And I guess, Andre, I'd like you to pick up the story there. How concerned should we be that if English Canada pushes too hard against Bill 21, that we're going to see separatism reborn in the province of Quebec?
Well, the truth is we don't really know. What my concern really is, I mean, I'm not saying that Canadians should not, voice their concern or express their opposition to the bill. I mean, we're in democracy and everyone, and this will, if the bill, the law will come to the Supreme Court, and whatever decision the Supreme Court renders may apply to the rest of the country. So Canadians have the right to express their views on Bill 21. However, I think we should not lose the perspective that the solution to this is for the National Assembly, the Quebec National Assembly, to amend or withdraw this law, and this has better chances of happening if Quebecers themselves are convinced that this is a bad law, and if they pressure the government to amend it, or possibly a government formed by another political party to amend or withdraw the law. So the solution to this problem will not come from Ottawa or from Brantford or from Calgary or whatever government, local or federal, gets involved in this. The solution to the problem is within Quebec, and that's why I'm saying, well, I mean, make sure that in other Canadians, when you get involved in the debate, have a positive impact rather than a negative impact of maybe convincing Quebecers that this has become a Canada versus Quebec issue. And of course, when that happens, Quebecers always defend their provincial government. That's sort of a reflex. So that's what we should avoid. And I think we can make this debate a debate about Quebecers' fundamental rights, all Quebecers' fundamental rights, and the Quebec Charter, and convince Quebecers. And apparently polls show that more and more Quebecers are convinced that this is a bad law that should be withdrawn.
Let me do a quick follow-up with you, because if I'm reading between the lines properly, it sounds like you're saying you approve of the approach that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has taken to this, which is to say, the Prime Minister's preference is not to get involved in this, but rather have Quebecers resolve this themselves. That would be the best possible outcome. Fair?
I'd add a couple of nuances there. I mean, I don't think, for instance, some people have suggested that the federal government should use its disallowance power and cancel or delete the bill. I don't think that's a good solution at all, because that would provoke a very strong reaction in Quebec. But I do think that if someone can stand up and defend in his speeches and whatever, can defend the Canadian Charter and Canadians' fundamental rights, that's the Prime Minister. So I'm not sure I understand exactly why, for instance, the federal government is not involved in the case in front of the Quebec Appeals Court. I mean, this law clearly flies into the face of the Canadian Charter, and the federal government, the government of Canada, should defend Canadian laws.
Having said that, Noha, let me ask you, do you understand why Prime Minister Trudeau has felt a need to tread very carefully as he either does or does not involve the federal government to a greater or lesser extent in the court challenge on this?
I'm definitely, I understand that it's complex for all the reasons that Andre described. And I do feel that a lot of this is maybe politically motivated, staying quiet about it, saying you're offended the questions even asked, for example, in a debate. That feels more politically motivated than anything else to me. Not striking down the law, I understand that for the reasons that Andre's mentioned. But I just have to say that there's a personal cost to this. Like we can debate it, in a more theoretical level, but there's a personal cost to this, not just to the specific people who are influenced by the law because they can't work in specific roles in Quebec. And to Paul's point earlier, there are people I've spoken to who say, oh, I might have to move, or I don't know that I can live here with this question. Maybe those who have been grandfathered in can stay in their jobs, but there's all sorts of bright young people who are looking to be lawyers or looking to be judges or looking to be teachers who can't do that now, and who are concerned that, okay, I can wait 5 years, but what if another 5 years after that, someone introduces something different. None of it's a guarantee. So there's a personal effect that way. And then there's also a personal effect on people like myself who aren't directly influenced by the law. And yet what I've found is that when these conversations happen, when the center debate in the province where I live, so I'm a Quebecer, I live in Quebec, and when the debate is about this stuff, this is the time that I experience more microaggressions, that people around me, and the numbers bear it out, experience more hate crimes and things like that. So even if I'm not directly influenced by in my workplace, this kind of discussion ongoing about what we need to do about minorities in this way or that way emboldens those who are racist to act out on that behavior in whichever way they're going to act out on it. And that's something that we have to deal with over and over. It's an extra burden on top of, everybody's going through a lot right now with COVID and with everything. So adding an extra burden on that is just not a lot of fun. So I do understand, the Prime Minister not trying to strike down the law altogether, but refusing to even really truly answer questions about it. Paul, I read your piece recently about this, and finding politicians who are trying to find the to say the least possible words in the longest way, it's quite disappointing, right? Because it's not a theoretical debate. It's got a very personal impact on a large swath of the population, or maybe not a large swath, and that's the whole issue. Where it's not a big enough voting block to matter to any specific politician. So how can they give the most meaningless soundbite and then move on?
I got a minute left, Paul, to get your views on. We've talked about Justin Trudeau. There's another leader in that House of Commons, though, who wears a turban, and he hasn't had a lot to say in pushback to Bill 21 as well. And I wonder how you feel about that.
Well, Jagmeet Singh is making more or less the same calculation that other people are, and perhaps all the more so because he faced a lot of questions and a lot of criticism when he became the federal NDP leader, because he was seen as essentially a one-issue Sikh nationalist politician who had gone into federal politics to pursue that, and so he's had to make it really clear that that's not the case. That he's the full buffet of concerns and interests and policies, just like all the other federal leaders. But Noha touches on an element of this that I really don't like, which is everyone else in Canada is having this debate except for the leaders of our federal parties, because they're making essentially cheap bets on potentially kind of accidentally winning 20 or 30 seats in Quebec, instead of talking to Quebecers like adults. And while I didn't agree with Andre that the rest of us should watch what we say or stay out, I will say that people in Quebec are perfectly capable of discussing this in like adults, including using some of the scary words like discrimination and minority rights and things like that. So the rest of us should feel free to join them and discuss this and many other issues with the richness and the delicacy that they deserve, rather than resorting to slogans and shouting down brown-skinned women journalists for asking questions in debates.
Understood. That's Paul Wells from Maclean's. We also thank Andre Pratte from Navigator, the former senator, and Noha Bashir, who, although in Chelsea, Quebec, is a big Montreal Canadiens fan, and we normally don't allow them on the agenda, but we make an exception tonight. Thank you all for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.